So thank you everybody for coming. My name is Shannon Port. I am the Associate Dean of the Library at Elgin Community College and also the President-elect of IACRL, as well as the Committee Chair of the Conference and Continuing Education Committee. And I know there's some of my committee members here, so thank you everybody for your help with getting JJ here. And let me introduce JJ. So JJ Pianki is the Unit Lead for Business and Social Sciences at the University Library at Iowa State University. And he's going to be talking about accessibility, focusing on neurodiversity in libraries, which is actually a lot of his research. So I'm really excited to hear what JJ has to say, and I will hand it over to JJ.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Also, Michigan fan, go blue. For those of you who graduated from Michigan. So I'm going to start talking about accessibility in your library, and more specifically, we're going to talk about sort of Disability 101 with a generous dash of neurodiversity. This is a participant-friendly event. So I'm going to want you either to unmute and say, and chime in. You can ask questions at any time. And or you can also light up the chat. I've got the chat open so I can see it. So yeah, it's gonna be awesome. All right, let's jump in. Who are these people? We're gonna start with audience participation right away. I got 3 pictures on the screen. Who are these people? Who do we know? Yep, we've got Giles. Giles is on the left-hand corner in the gray 3-piece suit. Who are the other 2? Wild guesses. Amy's like, I got nothing. I got no idea. Totally okay.
Woman in the middle is the librarian from the main New York Public Library and Ghostbusters, but I don't recall her name.
That is totally accurate. I don't remember her name either, but yes, that is Ghostbusters librarian from the original Ghostbusters on the top. So yes, lady from Ghostbusters, Christine and Grace, good job. What about lower right-hand corner? Anybody? Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. So if you remember when Indiana Jones is at X marks the spot and he's like taking a metal pole and he's like trying to break into the floor, every time he hits the floor, the librarian stamps a book and then he's like, I'm stronger than I think. I'm not touching that. So yes, Indiana Jones librarian on the lower right. So when we look at these 3 pictures, what stands out to us about these librarians? Old and white. Excellent. I see old white people, right? They're wearing suits. Because, I wear a 3-piece suit every day. No. So they're really nicely dressed. They're all older. They're all white. Is this problematic? Oh boy, howdy, yes it is. It is definitely problematic. Why is it problematic? Or why do you think it might be problematic? Feel free to unmute or throw something in the chat.
Well, it's not the communities we serve.
Exactly. It's not necessarily reflective of the communities that we have. And as Deanna says, if we want libraries to be for everyone, representation matters, right? These 3 pictures are actually a little skewed because we know that the profession is like 80, low 80s% white and female, right? So I've actually got 2 men on this picture. But more importantly, as Valerie is pointing out, media portrayal, right? This is how the media thinks of libraries. Now, these pictures are a bit older than, current media. Partially that's because I'm an old. And these are the pictures I think of when I think of librarians. But generally speaking, when people think about libraries, this is what they're thinking of, right? When we look at the backgrounds of our 3 media librarians here, what do we see? Books, print only, right? We see a lot of books floating around. We're not seeing computers. We're not seeing play space. We're not seeing different types of lighting. We're not seeing anything other than old books that would be in an old library that could be academic, right? Now we know that Giles and Indiana Jones librarians are actually in academic libraries. Ghostbuster librarian is in, I believe it's New York Public, or some version of New York Public. So, when we see these people and we look at these backgrounds, if you are Black, if you are in a wheelchair, if you have autism, if you are wearing hijab, these people could be very intimidating, right? I don't want to go up to Giles and ask a question. He's clearly very serious. He's very professional. I'm in a t-shirt and jeans, and I need to know where the bathroom is. Like, I don't want to ask him. So that representation matters part is really important, especially when it comes to disability. How our spaces look is really important. When we look at Ghostbusters librarian and we look at the area behind her, and I know it's hard to see because the area behind her is blurred a bit because the camera is focusing on her, but we see long wooden tables that are relatively close together. We see chairs with arms. If I'm in a wheelchair, the only place I can go is at the end of the table. So I'm sticking out in the aisle. People are going to trip over my wheels. They're going to trip over my bag. And I feel very conspicuous being out in the aisle. So I am very uncomfortable. Now, if I'm not in a wheelchair, I can't sit in a chair with arms. I got a booty. I got a big booty. So like there is no way I could sit in any of those chairs. So from my perspective as a person with disability and as a larger size person, this is not a friendly space for me, right? This is a space where I'm just like, maybe just in and out, get what we need and get out and not stay, right? And so for a lot of people with disabilities, this is actually a really common occurrence, is that they don't see a place where they can fit in, or where they feel comfortable. And so they're just like, let me get what I need and then let me leave, because I don't belong here. So on that happy note, let's talk a little bit about, well, what is disability? I've got 4 pictures here. What do they represent? Feel free to unmute or light up the chat. Physical disability represented by the wheelchair. Thank you. The autism symbol, which is the infinity symbol rainbow. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Color blindness is on the right-hand side. What about that one in the middle? The 4 people together, 1 person apart. Lauren, really good guess. So I use this one to represent like just mental illness, mental disability, because mental disability is really hard to actually turn into a picture. So anxiety, depression, PTSD, pick your mental health issue. Those are all kind of lumped into 4 people together, 1 person apart. So good job, recognizing what these symbols mean. Especially the color blindness one. One of the things that people don't realize is that just because you're colorblind, it doesn't mean you can't see the thing. It just means you can't see it in the color that it is. So like some colors, like if you're colorblind for green, excuse me, you might see the green color might seem like dirty mustard yellow to you. So you can still see that there's a number there, or that there's an object there. But generally speaking, it's going to look, the color is not going to be the same color. I used to know somebody who was colorblind and a hardcore video gamer. And I was like, well, what happens when like you absolutely must be able to see the color to get past something? And he's like, I hand the controller to my wife. Like he's like, there's no way around it. He's like, I try to go around those kind of roadblocks as much as I can. But sometimes I just have to give it to her and let her and walk her through it. Because I can't differentiate the colors. And so that's something actually to be aware of. A lot of people think of color blindness as you can't see that color or object at all, or shape on the screen at all, but that's not true. All right, so let's talk about autism for a second. So we have the neurodiversity symbol, which is the infinity symbol that's rainbowed. And part of that is because of this cartoon kind of says it all. I'll give you a minute to read the cartoon. Yes, I know. So the puzzle piece originated with Autism Speaks. People with autism generally feel that Autism Speaks is a hate group. So if you have Autism Speaks listed on your LibGuides or research guides, you may wish to put a caveat or a warning on that link. The reason people with autism consider it to be a hate group is that Autism Speaks was started by parents who were looking for a cure. And for people with autism, part of what they say is that there's nothing wrong with me, right? I have autism. This is who I am. I don't need to be cured. And so, as this cartoon says, I'm not missing a piece. I don't need solving. Also, up until basically right before the pandemic, there had never been somebody with autism on Autism Speaks board of directors. So a lot of people with autism have considered Autism Speaks to be not speaking for them. So it's something to keep in mind. The same thing with like Lighted Up Blue and all that kind of stuff, is that it's not necessarily doing what you think it should be doing. And those within that particular community view Autism Speaks very negatively. So that leads us to the question of like, well, what really is autism? It's not just one condition. It's actually kind of it's a spectrum disorder. And it's like, well, what's a spectrum disorder? This is from a different cartoon. And the reason I love it is because even though there's a lot of words here, I love that the picture in the middle, the circle, and in part because it shows you exactly what spectrum can look like, right? So if you're looking at this particular person, their executive functions in the middle, right? It's not high, it's not low, it's right in the middle. Their sensory filters are more towards the center. Their language is more towards the outer edge. So, some traits are going to be really easy for this person, and some things are not so much. Within the autism community, there's a lot of discussion of when you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, right? Because it's a spectrum disorder, autism looks differently in every single person. So, one person with autism might be completely verbal. The person right next to them, totally nonverbal. The person next to that person, somewhere in the middle, sometimes verbal, sometimes not verbal. And so forth. So it's not a binary, it's not a switch of, you know, if you have autism, then you're nonverbal and you have tics and, you know, you don't have any executive functioning. That combination may be true for somebody, but it is not true for everybody. And that's partially what makes autism such a hard disability to provide accessibility for, right? Because it's not just let me build a ramp, right? Or, you know, let me put in a handrail. You know, what works for one person with autism may not work with the other person for autism. And that's something that we really need to think about, is how do we work with that? I usually talk a little bit about, you know, people need to think about universal design and universal design for learning as ways to potentially be more accessible for more people. So it's much more about thinking it's about accessibility broadly than being specifically narrow for just one condition. That's not to say that you shouldn't focus on a single condition. There are definitely cases where we do it better for physical conditions like wheelchairs, cochlear implants, which is hearing, canes for eyesight, things like that. Libraries generally don't do very well with mental health and with invisible disabilities, fibromyalgia, chronic pain, diabetes, things like that. So, you know, what is this? You know, I've said neurodiversity. What is this neurodiversity thing? It's actually made up of a broad range of conditions, right? Autism is part of it, but it's also OCD, it's depression, it's, you know, developmental disabilities, it's ADD, it's anxiety. Essentially, if your brain works differently than everybody else's brain, you're neurodiverse, right? And this includes things like trauma, right? So, you know, people who have had either long-term trauma their brains are going to work differently, because the way they grew up in over a long period of time was different than quote unquote average. Okay. So neurodiversity can be a lot of different things. It's not just autism. Basically, if you think differently in some way from other people, you're neurodiverse. One of the things within the neurodiversity community is sometimes instead of saying neurodiversity, people will say neurospicy, which I love. I've got a neurospicy. There you go, neurospicy. I've got a neurospicy sticker on my laptop. Even though hot sauce and I are very much not together. It's like, get away from me. So yes. Okay, so that's neurodiversity and thinking a bit about what neurodiversity is. Autism is just a part of that, right? So, you know, we're gonna jump a little bit ahead, just in terms of, well, what do I do? What do I do in my library about this? Some of it is, nice, April. Some of this is thinking about doing thought exercises around, okay, if I have post-traumatic stress disorder, what does my library look like to me? Right? You know, as somebody with PTSD, I am looking for the table or the chair where my back is to a wall, so there's nobody behind me. I can see entrances and exits. I can see the entire room, so that I feel safe, right? And, you know, in that particular scenario, you don't need to have a sign saying PTSD people only should sit here. You know, I will find that chair. I will find that desk or that table, if it's available, right? And I will plop myself down on it, because that is instinctually what I'm looking for when I enter a room. You know, my PTSD is quote unquote complex PTSD. So it stems from prolonged trauma in childhood, which for me means that, yes, I do have a startle reflex, fight and flight, but a lot of things for me are just completely ingrained. So being hyper aware of my surroundings, having hyper acuity, and I also have advanced hearing. So like I hear a lot of conversations that I should not hear, and things like that. So sometimes there's a lot of thinking about, okay, if you have somebody with neurodiversity and, you know, whatever condition they have in these bubbles, how do we help them? For me, I do a lot of sensory overload. When it's a lot of people, when it's a lot of noise, it's overwhelming. For some people, that's not going to be an issue. But for me and for a lot of people who are neurodiverse, the sensory overload is very, very real. So having a quiet corner, or better yet, a quiet room where, you know, people can, you know, you call it a sensory room or a meditation room or a calm room, a respite room, pick your vocabulary. That is going to be a good place for someone like me. Double bonus points when you can get something extra. Is there a tranquility kit I can check out, right? And that tranquility kit might have noise canceling headphones, fidget toys. You know, we're moving into winter. Maybe it has an SAD light, right? Seasonal affect disorder light, all spectrum light. So having that kind of kit, can, you know, that's check outable, can allow me to try different fidget toys and, you know, find my center, find my calm. Valerie, excellent point. A weighted blanket. It doesn't have to be a massive blanket. It can just be, you know, like a little throw blanket, something I can, you know, put on my lap, something I can just put on my shoulders, you know, things like that. All of those things can be really useful and really valuable, especially, you know, if you're a student and you're feeling overwhelmed with midterms, finals, final projects, things like that. So those are all things to think about. I mean, you know, because we are going to be moving into finals after Thanksgiving, which is next week. Yes, I know that's kind of like a panic moment. Like, how did Thanksgiving get here so fast? It's early this year. One of the things that I've seen actually work really well is, you know, you have the therapy dogs and you might have donuts and things like that. Do a craft, you know, make and take, and you're making a fidget toy, right? You know, one of the easy fidget toys I've seen is you get a tube of mesh, sew up one end, put in a marble, sew up the other end, and then you just play with it back and forth. So, you know, that's a very much a make and take type of thing that students would actually really like. The materials are cheap, it's easy to make, they're easy and fast to make, so you can get through a lot of people. So yeah. Okay, so there's neurodiversity, and some ideas around things to think about. Come back here. Okay, so why do you think we need laws about disability rights? This sounds kind of like a weird question, but there you go. Why do you think we need laws about disability rights? Like the Americans with Disabilities Act. Any guesses? Equity, absolutely. We should be able to, people with disabilities should be able to live our full life, prevent discrimination, having, being required by law to make things accessible. Though, if you got here at the very beginning, Shannon and I were talking a little bit about there's a difference between ADA compliant and accessibility. ADA compliance is the bare minimum and it's the floor, so to speak. Accessibility is usually much different from ADA compliance. They're not directly related to each other. Deanna, absolutely right. We can't count on folks to automatically do what's right. And in fact, more often than not, especially for people with disabilities, they've been really abused. So this is a current map of states that allow forced sterilization without consent of people with disabilities. Notice Illinois is part of that list. So a judge could say, hey, JJ, I don't want you reproducing because you have disability. And I'm going to require that you be sterilized. And there's nothing I can do to fight that as a person with disabilities. It's much more, that scenario is much more prevalent in prison populations or incarcerated populations. There have been quite a few cases in California. But yeah, forced sterilization is a thing. And it is allowable in this country in 2023. This is why we need laws about disability and protecting people with disabilities. One of the things that I talk about when I do the Disability 101 webinar, this webinar is a little bit of a hybrid webinar, is I talk about how, when we think about the Holocaust, right, we all know what that is. We know that the Nazis murdered 6 million Jews, but the Holocaust didn't start with the Jews. The precursor group were people with disabilities. And the thinking was by the Nazis, if good Germans were willing to murder their family members in care facilities, it wouldn't be that far of a push to murder other undesirable peoples like Jews, homosexuals, Roma, Catholics, etc. And so people with disabilities were actually the test case. And they were also the test case for Zyklon B, which was the gas that was used in concentration camps. So that was the test case, was people with disabilities. It's a horrible period of history, and yet it still exists. So, and what do I mean by that? So we just had a pandemic. The pandemic, regardless of what the government says, is still going on, right? COVID has killed millions of people. It is also a mass disabling event. What do I mean by that? Basically, COVID, for quite a few people, what happens is COVID creates scenarios where you have extreme fatigue, brain fog, cardiac problems, circulatory problems, etc. Okay. So, and these symptoms don't go away in a week or two, right? They last for months and years. So we are in the middle of a mass disabling event. And that is incredibly problematic because, especially during the early days of the pandemic, Some doctors made determinations that a young and relatively healthy human should get a respirator and not the person who is in a wheelchair. This is documented. Like, we're talking about eugenics, and we're talking about it within the last 3 years in this country. And of course, now there's a bunch of lawsuits and all that kind of stuff going on right now. But it's scary stuff when, you know, medical professionals who should know better are making decisions about quality of life for people with disabilities and saying your life doesn't matter because you're disabled, and we're going to give medical care to someone we think is going to survive. I have strong feelings about this. Can you tell? Just a little bit. Okay, so the biggest piece of legislation in the US is the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. It's been amended and renewed. And basically, ADA covers any type of disability, including temporary disability. You fall, you break your leg, you're in a cast. You need to have your leg up on a pillow. You know, you need someone to help you get from your car to your office door or whatever. That's covered by the ADA, right? So guess what? COVID is covered by the ADA. And people don't quite realize that. ADA doesn't just cover physical disability, it also covers mental health, it covers virus or bacterial conditions that cause impairment. When we say disability, what we're saying is any kind of condition that prevents you from doing activities of daily living. Activities of daily living: brushing your teeth, making lunch, eating lunch, getting dressed, taking a shower, going to work, buying groceries, etc. Okay, so ADA covers you, and it's supposed to cover basically also not just federal buildings, but also buildings that receive public money. So you need to be accessible in terms of your buildings, in terms of your services, according to the ADA. ADA also covers you if you're an employee, and or if you're interviewing. ADA also provides you protections. There are problems with the ADA. I'm not going to lie to you. That's a whole different discussion. But ADA does provide for accommodations if you need them in the workplace. And that's a whole nother issue. Okay, some numbers here. Basically, according to the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, as of 2023, 27% of people in the United States have a disability. Over 1/4 of the population is disabled. That number has gone, come back here. That number has gone up significantly. I think pre-COVID, I think the CDC was saying something like 22% or 23%. So the number has actually gone up quite a bit. And remember, we're talking when every percentage point is millions of people. About 1 in 20 have experienced serious mental illness. The numbers that we have here are a little outdated because they don't include COVID numbers. So for instance, anxiety disorders is at 19%. We know that anxiety disorders is much higher right now. So like, I just went to the doctor last week and I asked him, I was like, you know, I've been feeling really overwhelmed lately. And, you know, part of that, I know why I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm moving, I've got a new job, you know, there's a lot going on in my life. I'm like, but this feels more than just new job and moving. And he's like, nope, you're right. He's like, I'm seeing a lot of people who are saying they're overwhelmed and it's getting worse. And I was like, oh, good to know. I'm not alone. It was actually kind of comforting. So we know anxiety disorder is much higher. Looking at these numbers, which number to you is actually really surprising? either shout it out or flop it into the plop it into the chat. Yes, more audience participation because I've been talking too long. Bipolar, probably because it seems like that number is low. Depression, remember depression here is being defined as major depression. We're talking about can't get out of bed for months at a time. Valerie just nailed it. Schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is listed here as less than 1%. And Valerie also nailed it on the head by saying, every time, the Law and Order, CSI, etc., those kinds of criminal crime procedural shows often have at least one episode about the violent schizophrenic. And the reality is that schizophrenia is actually an incredibly rare mental health condition. Most schizophrenics are actually nonviolent because they know that they're hearing voices that other people can't hear. And so most schizophrenics actually self-isolate. They stay away from other people because they know they're not acting normal. Put that in big quotation marks. This is a case of overrepresentation in the media, and overrepresentation in a really negative way that makes the general population feel that, one, schizophrenia is more prevalent than it actually is, and two, that this group of people is more violent than they actually are, which is super problematic, right? So this is definitely a case of the media not doing people with mental health disabilities any favors. Yan Ling is saying PTS high seems high. Actually, from my point of view, it's probably low. I would think it would be a lot higher, depending on how are you defining PTSD. When we say PTSD, and that's true for all of these, are we saying only PTSD, or are we also including PTSD otherwise non-specified according to the DSM, Diagnostic Statistical Manual? So technically, my diagnosis is post-traumatic stress disorder otherwise non-specified, because complex PTSD is not in the DSM. Generally speaking, PTSD is defined as a traumatic singular event or cluster of events: combat, car accident, bomb going off, school shooting, those kinds of things, and that it's a singular event, which then causes mental trauma. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder is a series of traumatic events over a long period of time, usually childhood, that cause the same kind of reactions as regular PTSD. I think when you combine the two of those, the number 3.6% is actually low. And I think it's actually much higher now because of COVID. So I wouldn't be surprised if all of these numbers, or a good chunk of these numbers, have gone up. I just don't have more recent numbers. The most recent number I have is the 2023 CDC number. The rest of these numbers are a bit older. So what is audience participation? What is the average time between onset of a mental disorder and getting help for that mental disorder? How long do you think? Go ahead and light up the chat, or feel free to unmute. Lauren, much longer than it should be. Yep, I agree. So we're getting months or years. Okay. Anybody got a number? Amy's throwing out 18 months. Sanga's throwing out a year. 3 years. All right, I'll put you all out of your misery. It's about 10 years. So the difference between onset and getting help is usually about a decade. There's a lot of reason for this. Part of it could be cost. Before the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, there were, basically insurance companies could basically say you only get 10 sessions and then you can never be treated for this ever again. Which, if you have a long-term condition like schizophrenia or major depression, you know that you need basically not constant care, but you need continuing ongoing care. So, why do people wait so long? We have Obamacare, we have the Affordable Care Act now. It makes it affordable, more affordable. It changed the rules. Yes, you have stigma, et cetera. Those are all good reasons why people don't get help. Not enough doctors is another great reason. The wait time to see a psychiatrist in Champaign-Urbana is like 6 months. So if you're looking for a diagnosis, which has to be done by a psychiatrist, it's a long time, right? Yeah, it's just not appropriate. But to really answer this question, we have to talk about the parable of the frog. If you throw a frog in a pot of boiling water, it's like, oh crap, and it jumps out, right? But if you throw a frog into a pot of cold water and you turn the heat on, that frog will stay in that pot until it dies. Why is this like mental health? Mental health doesn't usually have an immediate and violent onset. Sometimes it does, but it's not typical. What happens is you make a little tiny adjustment, and then you make another little adjustment. And those little adjustments happen over a long period of time until you've adjusted so far that you hit a crisis point. And that crisis point is usually directly related to the fact that you're acting in a way that is not normal or average. And when you hit that crisis point, that's when you probably land up seeing a medical professional, whether that's a therapist or your doctor, getting medication, doing talk therapy or whatever. But that distance between starting those micro adjustments and that crisis point is usually about 10 years. For me, it was about 25 between onset of symptoms and the events of mental health issues to actually getting assistance. I didn't get assistance until I went to Michigan for my MLS. And now, I see a therapist weekly. So yeah, it's a lot. Valerie's asking worldwide, in terms of statistics, what statistic particularly are you referring to, Valerie? Or just in general?
I was thinking of between the onset of symptoms and receiving treatment. I guess what I'm wondering is this long wait specific to the United States, or how might it compare to other countries? That's my curiosity, just because obviously we do healthcare differently here.
Right. That's a great question. I don't know is my answer. 10 years is definitely US centric. The only statistic I know off the top of my head is that the World Health Organization says about 15% of the global population has a disability. And that number really hasn't changed over the last several years. And that number is kept up to date. So globally, about 15-ish% has disability. but yeah, I don't know what the numbers would be in like a country for Uganda or Iceland or Germany or India, where you have very different social stratifications, and also very different availability of healthcare, especially mental health care. So that is a great question. Research project. Just saying. So yeah. Okay, so let's talk about language because we're starting to run out of time. Generally speaking, I go with people first. I am a person with PTSD, not a PTSD person. Everybody's different. Within the disability community, it basically kind of goes half and half. Some people like people first, some people like disability first. Some populations prefer disability first as a whole. If you are born deaf, then you prefer to be called deaf or a deaf person rather than I'm a person who has gone deaf. If you go deaf later in life, you're more likely to say that you are a person who has gone deaf rather than you are a deaf person. For people who were born deaf, there's a very rich culture of the deaf community, including music and art, language, and so forth. So autism is another community where there are definitely people within that community that are like, no, I'm autistic. I am an autistic, rather than I am a person with autism. When in doubt, just ask. People are usually pretty open to saying, yes, I have autism, or yes, I prefer people first, or whatever. So more language: handicap versus disabled versus functionally diverse versus diverse ability. Handicap is outdated. Please stop using it. It is not a handicap parking spot. It is an accessible parking spot. It is not a handicap bathroom stall. It is an accessible bathroom stall. So erase the word handicap from your vocabulary, because it's outdated, and basically offensive. Same thing with like the term wheelchair bound. Don't get me started. Erase that one out of your head too. Disabled, I don't like the term disabled. However, it is the lingua franca of this particular area of study. So the reason I don't like it is because it implies a binary. Either you're abled or you're not. Either you're disabled or you're abled. And that's not, well, that is technically true. Disability is also a spectrum. And it really depends on how you look at disability. So when I do this kind of session where I've got all your pictures up on the screen, I'll say something like, how many of you are wearing glasses or contacts? And then I'll say, congratulations, you have a disability and you're using an assistive technology. But glasses and contacts are so commonplace that we don't even think of them as assistive technologies. And we don't think of not being able to see the screen or not being able to see distance as being a disability. But it is, right? If you take away my glasses, I can't see anything. I am blind. Like, everything is blurry. So, it's also a matter of how are we conceiving or conceptualizing of what disability is. I like functionally diverse and diverse ability because it implies spectrum, because it implies the gray, so to speak, and not just either or. So one thing I want you to think about is the myth of average. Todd Rose does a great job of talking about average. He spends the first 10 minutes of his TED Talk giving us a lesson on the Air Force and how the Air Force had an average problem, and then in their cockpits. And basically the idea being, if you design to average, you are designing for nobody. nobody is completely average. We all have things that are average about us and things that are not, that we're exceptional at or that we're terrible at, right? And so this is something to think about in terms of libraries, because how often do we think of the average patron? And that's a trap. It's a trap. Thank you, Star Wars. So the second half of his TED Talk talks about how average is a trap in education. It's well worth a watch. You know, as I said, it's about 20 minutes. And so I would definitely encourage you to think about your libraries, about how you play to average, rather than understanding the extremes, right? And so when I say extremes, I'm thinking about Sinead Burke. Sinead Burke is a little person. Her TED Talk is about, I think, 10 minutes, 9 minutes. Highly recommended. Highly, if you have to choose between Rose and Burke, go with Burke. Love her TED Talk because she doesn't pull any punches. You know, she talks very explicitly about what is it like for her as a little person to navigate an airport, including things like having to stand on a trash can to lock the bathroom door. She doesn't pull any punches. I love it. I love her. She's great. So how do we combat this average? And one of the biggest things I'm going to tell you is ask your patrons. Flat out, ask them. Do a survey, do focus groups, do interviews. Look at their behavior, right? So the heat mapping, behavior mapping, usually it's a 1 hour mapping. So person sort of sits in a corner and just observes, you know, patron walks in the door, where do they go? And that's a color line, right? And then, you know, where do they go after that? On this particular map, and this is one I pulled off just the internet, you can see that there's very little usage of the squares in the lower left-hand corner. So if those are, for instance, tables where we would like to encourage people to study, there's something about that area that people don't want to go there. How do we change that? If I'd have to hazard a guess, I would say it's probably because there's too much furniture. So there's probably too many tables, too many chairs. Totally common issue in libraries of having too much furniture. So this kind of behavior map or heat map can reveal, well, how much is the reference collection getting used? How often are people going to that reference aisle? Do we really need it? You know, why aren't, we've got a beautiful setup with a table and chairs and a whiteboard, but we never have to fix the chairs. No one's using it. Why aren't they using it? Oh, it's because there's a half wall in the way. People don't know it's there. So, letting people show you their behaviors by doing a heat map can help you with spaces. Likewise, when you do a survey or focus group or interview, that can tell you what your other problems are. I don't feel safe. It's too loud. I can't focus. There's too much sensory input. Those kinds of things. That is going to pop up when you actually ask them what they want or what they need. One of the things I'm a big proponent of is stop guessing and actually ask, what does a person with disabilities actually want or actually need when they come into your space, digital or physical? So in terms of perspective, thinking about what does the space look like when you have autism? What does the space look like when you're 7 feet tall or when you're 4 feet tall? One of the things I have told people is grab your largest executive office chair or one of those big like strollers for running and move it around your library, can you get everywhere? Can you get to the back of the building? Can you get into the bathroom? Can you sit wherever you want to at a table or in plush seating? Or do you have to move furniture out of the way? Or are there places you can't get to because your chair won't fit? If the answer is, I can't get there, you need to move furniture around, right? Or get rid of furniture. So that's a perspective exercise that can be very useful when you're talking about actual physical spaces. Okay. We've got a couple minutes for questions, if you have any, and of course you can always email me as well. So, questions, answers, issues, worries, concerns, railing against the universe. Arr! I do a lot of railing against the universe. When you do disability work, there's a lot of railing. Feel free to unmute or throw something in the chat. No problem, Christine. I will stop the share there. There we go. And I'll give you a booster. There's my sweet Aiden. Yes, she's having a nice little nap in the cat bed. I have 2 Maine Coons. And they have definitely been amazing. Cost-effective ways to increase accessibility. Great question. First thing to do is, what are the issues in your library? So I would look at, do the perspective exercises, but also think about what's the low-hanging fruit and what's the, I really wish we had $100,000 to fix the elevator. So create a list that's graduated from super low-hanging fruit, free could be move your furniture around, to I need 100 grand for a new elevator. And when you make that list, you can use that list with donors. You can use that wish list with the university, and say, hey, this is not necessarily a nice to have. It's not necessarily a must have, but this would really help our students do better if we had an elevator that worked. Things like that. So there's definitely things to think about in those ways. Valerie is asking about tips and tricks to make open spaces less overstimulating. Lighting. When you've got the big overheads, the ballasts on big overheads give me a headache like you would not believe, because I can hear it. I can hear the ballasts, and that it just makes me bonkers. So having optional or different lighting. Likewise, if you can't change lighting, spend $50 and get one of those noise machines. And actually, especially when you're someone like me, the noise machine helps me drown out other sounds, like the sounds of keyboards clacking, the ballasts on the fluorescent lights, and things like that. So, those are all kinds of things to think about. Is, what colors are on your walls? Is it good old fashioned white? Or can you do some other calming color? I am partial to a nice calming seafoam green, and things like that. Temperature is a major concern, as April is pointing out as well. In terms of employee health, some people are, of a certain age and having hot flashes, in which case we should be allowing them to have a nice industrial fan to cool them off, right? Or likewise, they're taking a medication that makes them cold all the time. They should be allowed to have a heater. or to, you know, have a throw blanket and an extra sweater, you know, all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of options about accessibility and accommodations. Some of them are going to be really cheap and free. Some of them are going to be super expensive, depending on what it is, of course. I would say the biggest thing you can do is to do an accessibility audit of some kind, ask your patrons what they want or need, and then develop a plan. What are the things you want or need or would like? And then, are there grants? Are there friends of the library? Are there donors that you can say, hey, this is a really nice to have, because it would help students be able to focus better. So that kind of stuff. Okay, any other questions? Those are all great questions. Ruth, Tranquility Kit is it was a kit that was developed at University of Illinois. And basically it contained noise canceling headphones, fidget toys. We also put a all spectrum light in there for seasonal affect disorder, seasonal affect disorder. And so it was actually it came in a not a box, but it came in a container that you could check out for 2 hours in the library. And it also included like some cards to popular meditation apps that were free, you know, things like that. We also had just noise canceling headphones that were available. So if you didn't want the full kit, you could just, you know, check out a pair of noise canceling headphones. So that's what the Tranquility Kit was. We called it a Tranquility Kit. You could call it a sensory kit. You could call it all sorts of other things, depending on what you put in it. All right, friends, it is 1 o'clock. And if you have further questions, please feel free to email me. I hope this was helpful for all of you. I hope it gave you some ideas. Accessibility is not a one and done. And there's also kind of no one right way to do accessibility. There's always lots of different types of options. So keep an open mind and be good. If you can't be good at it.
Thank you so much, JJ.
You're welcome.
All right. Take care, everybody. Thank you for coming.